So here's that second parable now, Matthew chapter 25, verses 14 to 30. For it will be like a man going on a journey, who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. He who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. So also he who had the 2 talents made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Now after a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. And he who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, saying, Master, you delivered to me 5 talents here. I have made 5 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. And he also, who had the 2 talents, came forward, saying, Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. Here, I have made 2 talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. He also, who had received the 1 talent, came forward, saying, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid. I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, you have what is yours. But his master answered him, You wicked and slothful servant. You knew that I reap where I have not sown, and gather where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him who gets, and give it to him who has the 10 talents. For to everyone who has will more be given, and he will have an abundance. From the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. You might remember that this time last week, Jenny and I had our daughter Jo and family staying with us. They live in Kent, something like 340 miles away. But with the improvements, the road networks over the previous years, they've even included the A303 on there. That means that that journey now is a pretty reliable 6 hours on the road. You've got to allow for stops, of course, and with 2 little kids on board, they might need to make a few more stops. Anyway, when Jo texted us last Saturday to say that they had left at a certain time, I worked out that their arrival time could be something like just after midnight. And amazingly, that's precisely what happened. Something like 5 or 10 past midnight last Sunday morning, 2 sleepy grandsons were carried from the car and tucked carefully into their bunk beds. And it was pretty much the same the way home on Thursday. Set off, we obviously know what time they set off, and we got a text to say that they'd arrived pretty much when we calculated. Of course, some of us can remember when Exeter was 3 hours away. The A30 went through so many of those town centres. I'm sure some of us have seen far more of Oakhampton than we ever wanted to. Nowadays, just to get the other side of Bodmin, well, what used to be sometimes an hour, that's 30 minutes and perhaps even less as the road continues to be improved up from Chiltern Cross. Many years ago, we had some family members who lived up in Camberley in Surrey. When they came down for a holiday, they typically came to stay with us. But journey times in those days were not just longer, they were much less predictable as well. And on several occasions, I can remember working out what I thought would be the time that they would have been able to arrive if everything went smoothly. And with youthful enthusiasm, going up the road from our bungalow in Madruth around the corner where I could see a fair old distance down a road and wait for them to come. On one occasion, I think I must have spent about 2 hours there, just hanging around, mooching, getting totally bored, waiting for that car to finally come around the corner with my cousins on board. I think we face a similar dilemma, actually, when we think about the return of Jesus Christ. We're told that it's certain. We're told to be ready for it, as if it could happen at any moment. But we're also given some very clear hints that, at least in terms of when these things were written down, there was going to be quite a substantial delay too. And we don't know just how long. We're told some things about what to expect from that delay. We should expect people to mock us, perhaps mock us increasingly, for holding on to something as apparently increasingly ridiculous as believing that Jesus Christ will really return in person and wind up the history of this world in a stroke. That's what the Apostle Peter wrote. Scoffers will come in the last days with scoffing. They will say, where is the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all things are continuing as they were from the beginning of creation. Peter gives his readers some answers to that accusation. He says, first of all, God's clock ticks differently from ours. So do not overlook this one fact, beloved, that with the Lord 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as 1 day. And there's a purpose to his non-immediate return as well. The Lord is not slow to fulfill his promise, as some count slowness, but is patient toward you, not wishing that any should perish, but that all should reach repentance. But that will not hold things up indefinitely either. But the day of the Lord will come like a thief, and then the heavens will pass away with the Lord. So the question is, folks, as we are still in this in-between time, what are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to be ready and waiting like me as a little kid, just sitting on the grass and watching the empty road? Or what? Jesus' followers had asked him about this kind of thing back at the beginning of the previous chapter, Matthew 24, verse 3. Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? These things, including the destruction of the Jewish temple, just across the valley from where they were sitting, the Mount of Olives. Jesus' reply, you hopefully remember, first of all, hit on the very distinct possibility of confusion and even deception about these things. Jesus answered them, see that no one leads you astray. It's certainly a bit confusing because, remember, Jesus' answers do not all have a clear date stamp on them. They're like pictures, I said last time, painted without perspective. Are things, some things, are they near in time and loom larger on that account? Or are they further away and only appear smaller because of it? We don't really have enough clues to nail it down unambiguously. We do have a hint, I think. There's going to be quite a lot of time involved. You couldn't say this for sure with just chapter 24 and the comment in a mini parable, basically. But if that wicked servant says to himself, my master is delayed, that's no more than a hint there. But moving to chapter 25, and in both of those parables we've looked at this morning, we've got this. The first one, as the bridegroom was delayed. In the second one, now after a long time, the master returns. So to my mind, Jesus is not just preparing his disciples then for there being a far longer wait for these things happening, but he's speaking more clearly to us in the middle of or towards the end of this long period of delay. 2,000 years later, still not knowing precisely when Jesus is going to come around the corner. So that means we need today's two parables to give us the proper balance. As Jesus teaches that awaiting his return, his followers need to remain prepared, but to make use of the delay as well. So first of all, we hear about the bridesmaids, and then we hear about those stewards. First, the bridesmaids who were told to be ready. So Jesus has just finished that parable, mini parable, about a wicked servant exploiting his master's absence, abusing his fellow servants, but caught in the act when the master finally returns home. The master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect it, and at an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces. That is, by literal translation, it is cut in half, and put him with the hypocrites. Obviously, a little bit of exaggerated language in telling of stories. But look, weeping and gnashing of teeth, that comes up at the end of our second parable this morning as well. Exactly what that will be, I don't know, but it's something pretty awful, isn't it? And to emphasize the point, the next section starts with the word then. There's a connection at that kind of time. Jesus tells us his story based on the way they did wedding celebrations in those days. Then the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom. Now, this is a rather curious story. You stop and think about it, isn't it? It's a wedding, and in our society, what is a wedding all about? Whose day is it? Not the way Jesus tells the story. There's a bridegroom, there's bridesmaids, but there's no bride. Just notice that we need to be careful not to draw out too much from this parable. It is, I'm saying this reverently, just a parable. Parables are limited. They're not the same as allegories, where almost everything has some secret coded meaning. So the absence from the bride from this parable shouldn't be taken to imply something about what some Christians call the rapture, when they say believers who are the bride of Christ will be taken out of this world to be immediately with Christ and returning with him maybe 7 years later to reign. You can't read that into this. It's not fair. I don't really think that was in Jesus' mind at all when he tells this story. I think we have a much simpler explanation. There's no bride in the story because there simply doesn't need to be to make the point Jesus wants to make. The sole point is about his followers being ready for his return at any moment. And that's like what happens to bridesmaids in that culture with weddings in those days. So all we need in Jesus' story, all Jesus needs to include there is a bridegroom and some bridesmaids. Well, that's the nearest thing we have to it nowadays, at least. So here's the setup. There's your bridegroom, and here's the bridesmaids. Goodness, it was hard work finding a picture with 10 bridesmaids. I know you'll say there's 11 up there if you count carefully, but I think the one just right off centre might actually have a sort of wedding baby kind of thing. It's difficult to see. So there are 10 bridesmaids there. Now, it's not totally clear what happens in weddings in those days, but it's clearly not the same. It's not identical to 21st century weddings. And the way Jesus tells the story, it looks as if it would often be the case that the bridesmaids and the bridegroom went to collect the bride, probably then making some kind of procession to some kind of celebratory venue. That's all we really need to know about that background. But I think we need to mention lamps as well, because probably, I think it's a slightly confusing translation to say the word lamp. We probably think in terms of those indoor lamps that we've probably seen pictures of. But those would not be a whole lot of use out of doors, even if the weather is a little bit less frantic than it was this week. The slightest breeze and outside, something like that's going to just disappear. So I think we probably need to reckon in terms of torches, like that, which are far more suitable for an outdoor procession. And the word that Matthew uses could cover that as well. So you've basically got a branch with one end wrapped around with rags and given a preliminary soaking of oil. But when the time came to light them, some further oil could be added. And that would be enough to keep these torches ablaze, and very pretty too, because they could then waggle them around. It's a bit of firewood, basically, for a nighttime procession down through the local streets. The only trouble was that some of these girls were rather more forward-thinking, more practical than others. Jesus sets the stage very generally with his introduction, giving the outline of what's going to happen. Now we start to get the detail. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. How does that wisdom or stupidity show itself? Bringing that extra oil or not? When the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them, but the wise took flasks of oil with their lamps. But look, here's another way in which Jesus' society was different from ours. A bridegroom would have to do various things in order to prepare for the event, right up to the last moment, and had to get all of those complete before he could come and collect the bride. And that's probably the context to what Jesus says in this famous verse, John 14, if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. But as we all know, jobs that should be small sometimes aren't. And society back then was not driven quite as much, not wedded to the clock as much as we are in our society. So none of this 6 hours drive and I'll be there. It's much more in terms of I'll be there when I'm there. And in fact, I rather reckon that Cornish people have been quite at home in Middle Eastern directly culture. So there are the 10 girls, I was going to say ready and waiting, but that's not quite right, is it? There are only 5 that are really ready and waiting, the others are just waiting. But time draws on and the inevitable happens to them all. As the bridegroom was delayed, they all became drowsy and slept. Remember, no TV, no screens in those days to keep them awake until the middle of the night. So when somehow, and we're not told, we don't need to be, how this cry comes to their ears, we don't need to be told. It just happens as part of the story. They hear that the bridegroom is finally arriving. But at midnight, there was a cry. Here is the bridegroom, come out to meet him. Now's the moment to not just put that final brush through their hair, because after all, they've been sleeping on it. Okay, looking just right. But no, those torches, they need that extra boost of oil. And all those virgins rose and trimmed their lamps. Now the difference emerges. 5 of them don't have that extra oil. There's not enough spare to go around either. Again, don't get snagged up about whether those 5 wise ones were actually 5 mean ones, saying, no, you're not having any of my oil. That's just part of the story. Live with it, follow the story. And the foolish said to the wise, give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out. But the wise answered, saying, since there will not be enough for us and for you, go rather to the dealers and buy for yourselves. Perhaps some astute local merchants will realize that there's one of these weddings going on, and there's always some people who need oil at those kind of times. There's always someone who forgets. And of course, in the middle of the night, they could charge more for antisocial hours. Amazingly, these 5 less prepared girls do seem to run off into the night to see what's possible. Unfortunately, while they are flying hither and thither, while they were going to buy, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went in with him to the marriage feast, and the door was shut. Now, here I think it's where Jesus stretches this little parable into something rather surreal. You mean, would latecomers really be locked out of a local wedding celebration in first century Judea? I kind of doubt it. The girls would probably expect to be let in quietly with as little fuss as possible, because they're going to be a bit embarrassed. But they'd expect to be let in and slyly take their place at the back somewhere. But no, as so often Jesus' parables have a sting in the tail. Afterward, the other virgins came also saying, Lord, Lord, open to us. Not saying that the bridegroom here is also doubling up as the bouncer in his own wedding feast. I think we picture this as the word being taken to him at top table and an uncompromising message sent back. But he answered, truly I say to you, I do not know you. And then Jesus' conclusion of that first parable, pointing out again the necessary lesson to learn and action to take. Watch, therefore, for you neither know the day nor the hour. And therefore insisting that there's something in this parable that applies in this way. But I don't think it applies just to this parable, but back into the previous chapter. You've got in 24:42, therefore stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But, I'll put that on screen. Does a sort of alarm bell ring? Or hold on a minute. In this parable, all of the girls did fall asleep. There's not the slightest hint of them doing anything wrong. In fact, it will be the sensible thing to do if they're going to be partying that late into the night. Grab a few minutes or few hours shut eye if you can. As the bridegroom was delayed, they all became drowsy and slept. The only difference is that 5 of the girls had already done all that they reasonably could do by bringing that extra oil. So they were as ready as they could be. And that's what it says in verse 10. Those who were ready went in with him to the marriage feast. So what I think this is saying is that just watching, just by itself, doesn't cut the mustard. You watch in the fullest sense by also being prepared for that event. Not by propping your eyes open with matchsticks, but by bringing that oil that your torch will need. You know, you can work it out, you can apply yourself, that you know this will be needed. So, to use one of those old hymns, watching and waiting, looking above, is not a lot of use if we're not filled with his goodness and lost in his love already. Merely watching can be a distraction from also being prepared. So what would that mean? I do find this a bit tricky to apply, but I wondered, if you go back a few decades, people were really obsessing, and I don't think it was worthwhile, spending so many hours speculating over whether the expansion of do you remember what it was, the EEC, European Economic Community, Common Market, the expansion to 10 members. Now, was that terrible scenario predicted in the book of Revelation? Some Christians really obsessed with that. Instead of spending your time obsessing about that, which could be but could not be, shouldn't you be getting right with a brother or sister that you have been refusing to speak to for 10 years? Isn't that the kind of preparation that Jesus would much rather have? Nowadays, instead of subscribing to every prophecy watch group you can find on Facebook or Instagram, how about spending some time with someone who's finding their daily walk with Jesus difficult? You're the one there, perhaps committed to them as part of a church covenant fellowship. Isn't that what Jesus would have you do, rather than just watch the latest nonsense posts scroll past on the screen? Just go and listen, just share some well-chosen scripture, just pray. If you're not prepared in that way, well, maybe you should go and learn some of those scriptures so that you can minister at a time like that. Spend some time being an example of gracious godliness in your own home, your own situation, instead of rushing off to yet another Christian meeting. But what about, generally speaking, as this second parable shows us, in the right sense, be busy. You can overdo it, but can underdo it too. Notice the connection. For That links it back to the parable we've just read. It will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. Yes, it's like the lead up to a wedding feast. And yes, it's also like the servants being left in charge of their master's property and business. This master is a canny guy. He knows that his servants are not equally competent. Maybe it's also that they're not quite as confident yet. So he allocates different levels of responsibility. Makes total sense to me. To one, he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. And then he went away. Before we get into this story proper, just a word about that word talent. I think it's unfortunate, really, that we have the word in English meaning a skill or aptitude. So the parable too easily becomes simply use your talents, the things that you can do well for Jesus. Now, it might well boil down to that. But just try and keep in your head as we go through this, that a talent in those days was a unit of weight primarily, which was becoming associated with a unit of money. It's just like there was many years ago, the standard British pound. That is the 1844 Troy pound. That brass or whatever it is in that wooden block there. And there was a time when a pound of weight meant a pound of value. Then, of course, inflation messed up that. But back in Jesus' day, a talent was a substantial unit of weight. So when it was associated with coinage metals like gold or silver, you have an enormous sum of money. Now, quite possibly Jesus is talking about a talent of silver here, because when you read on saying the guy who buried his stuff in the ground, the word for money there is actually literally silver. And of course, nowadays we'd have quote marks silver coinage. But it could have been gold. It could quite well have been talents of gold, in which case we're talking about a talent of gold will be something like 20 years' wages. So 5 talents is going to be well over $1 million. We're talking something like 10 times the amount of investment that these budding entrepreneurs on the apprentice are bidding for, scrabbling for. And you recognise the setup of the story, don't you? There was an Englishman, an Irishman, and a Scotsman. Oh, there was a vicar, a priest, and a pastor. 3 characters. The first 2 to set up a pattern, and the third one to surprisingly break it. The first one of Jesus' 3 servants is exemplary. Notice the right away. He who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. He obviously had a better business plan than those jokers in the penultimate episode of The Apprentice. Quite a challenge to put together a business plan to handle so much money at once, but he does it. So this is really rather impressive. He will be hired. Second one, more of the same. Well, actually less of the same, but pretty similar really, and the same percentage profit. So also he who had the 2 talents made 2 talents more. But now, not immediately the full sting in the tail, but a setup of that sting with a bit of a twist. Number 3 doesn't continue the pattern. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's silver, literally. So there's the quick setup. Now for the more interesting bit, and of course, it's a setup that we're automatically going to be thinking, what's going to happen to this guy when we come to the 3rd person, 2nd time? Now, for a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. Jesus now draws this out. Notice, it takes longer going through the 2nd time because the suspense is building about the guy who hid his talent in the ground. And settled accounts with them. But he who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, saying, Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here, I've made 5 talents more. Okay, we get the message. 5 talents, 5 and 5 more. Right, okay. No immediate surprise here, because the master is obviously going to be approving of this. His master said to him, "Well done, good and faithful servant." But did you notice the degree of further greater responsibilities that's involved? And if this is in any way a picture of heaven, what does that mean? Did you ever stop to consider what much might be for you and for me? Or were you just thinking that heaven was supposed to be eternal rest, a bit like with an extended retirement, but with your youthful vigor and health and all-round energy of your 20s again, but forever? No, I don't think so. You have been faithful over little, I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. Might want to talk about what that much might be when we think about this again this evening on Zoom. Anyway, second guy. Oh, you scarcely noticed that the verse changed, the number at the top changed. It's identical. 2 talents more, and his master says to him exactly the same. "Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master." Are you not itching for the third guy? See how Jesus makes us wait? I wonder actually with the second guy, only 2 talents, but identical words. Does this mean it's a bit like a kid who's just a bit younger at school, who is actually in time going to become just as proficient at reading as the other kid, who's just now a bit older and more experienced? Are things going to even up when it comes to heaven, do you think? Or will we be just totally content to be in heaven with different levels of abilities and responsibilities? Think about that later, maybe. But here's the crunch point. Servant number 3, with a totally different approach to risk, and rather forthright in assessment of his master's character too, don't you think? Not overburdened with tax, this guy, is he? He also, who had received the 1 talent, came forward, saying, "Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent here in the ground. Here, you have what is yours." And I can just see him at that point, dumping this on the table, chucking it at the ground at his master's feet. "Here, you've got what's yours back." There's rather a lot that's unattractive in those words and the attitudes he seems to be betraying. He is manifestly lazy because the master says that, but I think there's a load of resentment in there about what we don't know, sullen, he's certainly risk averse. His view of the master is totally at odds with the guy we've seen presented delighting over his first 2 servants' success. So folks, is it possible that at times your image of God is telling us more about you than about God? If you think he's mean and overbearing, what does that say about you? If you think he's a spoilsport, what does that say about you? If you think he is just concerned about you and me keeping a set of rules to live by, what does that say about us? I can't say that I'm surprised that this guy was only given a mere $500,000, 1 talent, if he's so full of attitude as this. You could say that at least he's dutiful. He didn't go and waste it all like the prodigal son, did he? In fact, I wonder if Jesus could be implying that he's a bit like the Pharisees, because they had kept God's word intact and pure. They were obsessed with it. It's a bit like burying it in the ground. Yeah, every rule that they could extract from it, they would labor to keep. Although, as Jesus had said not long previously, you've neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. Though they might have claimed that they were watching out for the coming of the Messiah, when he did come, they were far from ready and prepared to receive him. Here's the one that they had in principle been waiting for all through these centuries. And when he arrives, it's as if all they can do is say, here you are, I've kept all the rules, and they dump the bag of silver in his feet. So just like the Pharisees, this man is self-condemned. It happens with so many people who reject Jesus Christ, isn't it? They don't want grace, they just want recognition for their doing their dutiful bit. That should be enough, shouldn't it? I've not been any worse than the next man, have I? What more can you expect? Well, I don't think anyone expected what comes next in this story of Jesus. Yes, the guy is self-condemned. Master's response explains that very clearly and calmly. Well, if you know that I'm that mean, and you've had so long to dwell on it, shouldn't you at least have worked out you could deposit this with the bankers and get some interest? At my coming, I should have received what was my own with interest. You could have worked that one out during this time. And if you really were afraid, you would have. So I don't think that this guy's excuse holds any water at all. See, the thought is the same again. This man is simply not prepared for what he knows must happen when his master returns. Just as the 5 silly bridesmaids also must have been able to work out what they would need when the bridegroom finally appears. But this is now getting seriously weird again, isn't it? Right at the end of the parable. Take the talent from him and give it to him who has 10 talents. I wonder if this is about what the grace of God is like. Have more and even more. Remember, if you didn't get that, this master has already said that the 5 talents, something like £2 million plus, that's chicken feed. So, yeah, another talent here or there, who cares? For everyone who has will more be given, and he will have an abundance. Live by grace, and you will receive even more grace. Judge not, and you will not be judged. Condemn not, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. Try to live by the letter of the law, ignoring grace, and you lose big. From the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness. In that place there will be, again, weeping and gnashing of teeth. Folks, watching and waiting for the coming of the Lord isn't just about obsessing over Bible prophecies, but preparing ourselves for that time when he will stand again on the earth. Like the wise bridesmaids, we need to be prepared, we need to be living lives that are already manifesting the fruit of the Holy Spirit, growing in grace, growing in righteousness, because the place we are going to be taken to is new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. And like the busy servants entrusted with goods beyond anything they could ever lay any claim to, we need to be busy. We need to be daring. We need to invest our time, our thoughts, our lives, our hearts into things that are the interests of our absent master. So that when he returns, he may receive the return on his investments. Folks, we are promised better, something far better than merely talents of gold in following Jesus Christ. Stay ready. Use the time well. And remember this promised invitation. Enter into the joy of your master. Folks, let's pray, shall we? Father, it's so possible to be just distracted into speculations without end about when and how Jesus will return. But Lord, would you please help us to learn how we may be ready how we may be busy about your business, not that that busyness becomes a distraction in its own self. But Lord, that so we might be delighted to hear that midnight cry. The bridegroom is finally arriving. And that we are called then to enter into the joy of our Master, our Lord and our Saviour, Jesus Christ. Amen.